So the fairly obscure drug Ibogaine has made a cameo into the story around Paul Pelosi and his alleged attacker, David DePape. Let's roll this clip from Fox News' Jesse Waters.
So people are saying DePape was an Obama supporter who was psychotic and paranoid and a heavy drug user. And neighbors say DePape was taking a psychedelic drug called Ibogaine that made him imagine invisible fairy friends. And he often ranted on his blogs about not being able to buy a fairy house with doors.
So I think this is the first time that our friend Jesse Waters has heard of the drug. He mispronounced it. But to get a real 101 on it, we wanted to bring in really the country's foremost expert on Ibogaine. So joining us now is Alan Davis, PhD. He's the director of the Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education, assistant professor at the College of Social Work, Department of Psychology at Johns Hopkins University. Did I get all of that right, or did I get or any additional titles to throw on there?
No, that sounds good enough for tonight. Thank you.
So, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. You've done so much academic work on Ibogaine. First of all, what did you think when you saw it kind of bubble up in the national media for this one blip of a second?
Honestly, it was a little bit surprising. I think in the hype of what's been reported on about this incident, that was the least thing I thought was going to come up in the media. So a little bit surprised.
And so tell us a little bit about Ibogaine. Tell what is it?
So Ibogaine is a dissociative psychedelic drug. It is broadly in the same category as other things like psilocybin and LSD, although it does differ somewhat in how it's used and in what kinds of experiences it brings about in people.
And can you tell us more about what those experiences might be for the average Ibogaine user? And then in that context of Jesse Waters aside, what could have possibly been happening if the attacker had consumed Ibogaine in the time before the attack?
So one thing that's important to keep in mind is that Ibogaine is very rarely used recreationally. In fact, I would hazard a guess that it's almost never used recreationally. In general, Ibogaine is used as a therapeutic drug in places outside of the United States to treat addiction and other types of mental health problems. For those that do perhaps use it for non-therapeutic reasons, maybe for their own psychological or spiritual development, it's often used still with that kind of intention. So the idea that Ibogaine would be used as a recreational drug ongoing, misused in that way, seems very unlikely to me.
Mm. And more to the point, and you've covered or whatever, I don't know what the academic word is for a lot of treatment sessions. And so to me, the idea that somebody on Ibogaine could even leave where they were strains all credulity. Like, you are so kind of debilitated by the drug for so long that it seems implausible that you could do anything at all. Can you describe like what it's like to go through the experience?
Yeah, that's a great summary of it. Honestly, the experience with Ibogaine is something that usually people are lying on a bed. They are immobilized to a large degree for most of the acute drug effects. And again, because it's used with this therapeutic intention, in most cases, it is a time for people to reflect inwardly. They are potentially having hallucinations. Often they're getting psychological insights. Typically, they're reliving some of the most difficult and challenging times of their life. This is not your kind of run-of-the-mill club drug. This is something that is, frankly, quite difficult for a lot of people to go through because of the things that it brings up psychologically. So, yes, it would be very surprising to me if someone was, quote unquote, on Ibogaine and able to, be mobile and doing things.
Yeah, and I think also one of the reasons Ryan, I know, wanted to cover this is to ask what therapeutic benefits exist with Ibogaine, which is not legal to my knowledge in the United States. I believe it's legal in Mexico, but there's evidence, as I understand, that Ibogaine as a sort of therapeutic intervention for folks can be powerful and can have some efficacy. Can you tell us about what the evidence suggests? I mean, a lot of people probably think, as we're talking about drugs like this, of ayahuasca, which is much more commonly known in the States. But what is the evidence when it comes specifically to Ibogaine?
So there is a growing body of research that has been looking at this very question, in part because people, including some of the research I've done on U.S. military veterans, have been going to Mexico and other places abroad to get treatment for mental health problems, in part because they viewed the current treatment offerings in the United States as insufficient. And what we're seeing in the research is that for people with addiction, for people with PTSD, anxiety, depression, for a whole host of different problems, people are reporting that after they have an Ibogaine experience, that they are feeling better, that their symptoms are improved. And it's even to the point where now there are several clinical trials that are in the planning phases in order to start testing this in a medical system here in the U.S.
And when you talked about the way that you're completely immobilized and that people aren't doing it recreationally, I think an important layer of context to add to that is that it's utterly, from what I understand, I've done ayahuasca, but not Ibogaine, utterly terrifying, like horrifying, like an experience that people are only undergoing because they've tried everything else and they've hit rock bottom, but they desperately want to change. Now, there's been some reporting that Hunter Biden went to Mexico and was able to successfully and to credit this with helping him become sober with apparently the blessing of his father. What do you know, and what do we know about Hunter Biden's experience with Ibogaine?
Well, I think what we know is that it's consistent with the reports that we're finding in the research studies that we've done following military veterans and other people who are seeking out treatment in Mexico for the same reason, because the treatments that they've tried to date have not worked for them. And you're absolutely right that these experiences can be quite difficult and for some people even traumatic, but it's worth it to go through it for some people because it does bring about, for those that experience benefit, a positive outcome. I should mention, though, that it doesn't necessarily work for everyone. Some people are not going to respond to this treatment, but at the same time, it seems that it's working better for some than the treatments they have access to here in the States.
I have a two-pronged question, which is, are there dangers to having it criminalized and illegal in the United States? That is to say, is the sort of black market for Ibogaine something that should concern us? And the second part of that question is, if you could just tell us, what is Ibogaine in nature? How is it harvested? Where does it appear in nature? And what's the experience of sort of physically ingesting it? What does that involve typically?
So to answer the first question about the illegal drug market, I would imagine that the illegal drug market for Ibogaine in the U.S. is very small, in part because it is readily accessible in neighboring countries and because it's relatively unknown. Very few people know about it. And given the difficult types of experiences that can come up, it's, again, not something like alcohol or caffeine that can be widely abused. So I think that when I think about the illegal drug market, I think about the fact that, the real dangers that we have with our drug policy system here in the States is the fact that we classify these drugs as very dangerous and illegal. And in fact, they're safer on average than many other drugs like tobacco and alcohol that are freely available and regulated. So I think from that perspective, we're talking about substances that have very little risk compared to others. To answer the other question, Ibogaine comes from a shrub in Western Africa, and the alkaloid that Ibogaine it's typically extracted from there and ingested, and the effects can come on and last over the course of 24 to 72 hours, depending on the amount that's consumed and the metabolism of the individual. Typically, within 24 to 36 hours, people are on the tail end of their experience. But during that time of the acute effect, people are almost in like a dreamlike state where they're experiencing these flashes, these memories, these emotional experiences, as well as for some, especially if they're dealing with withdrawal from another substance like opioids or alcohol, they might be experiencing some withdrawal symptoms. Although interestingly, people report that the withdrawal symptoms after using Ibogaine, withdrawal from the drugs that they're trying to get off of, are actually quite reduced or almost completely gone, as opposed to other treatments that are available, which people have to suffer through experiencing those withdrawal symptoms, which is one of the benefits that people describe from seeking this treatment out.
And I've also heard of reports of heart complications related to Ibogaine. At the same time, though, most people who are going to be using Ibogaine already have severely compromised systems, just from whatever health trauma it was, the addiction crisis brought them to this point. So maybe that plays a role in the reports that you get around the heart issues. But what do we know about the cardiovascular question?
So we do know that there is a small risk for people, likely people who already have cardiac complications, that there can be a cardiac risk to consuming this drug. In fact, when the centers that provide this treatment abroad in legal contexts, when I'm evaluating whether or not that's a center that's likely doing this on the up and up and not just trying to take people's money and not doing a good job, one of the things that I try to look for is whether or not they're providing consistent cardiac monitoring and screening for heart risk ahead of the treatment, in part because of this risk that does exist. And it's a little bit of an unknown question right now whether that risk is due to the fact of the drug and that it's just going to with some predictability for some people produce this problem, or like you said, is it a combination of people's background and perhaps misusing of other substances that's creating this possible risk. But either way, cardiac monitoring is recommended for people who are seeking this treatment.
And that brings us back to David DePape. When I saw that picture that I think, was it Michael Schellenberger that first posted the photo of it, said, miracle drug treatment. And it was a reference to the kind of compound where he was living in the Bay Area doing these Ibogaine treatments. I was like, oh my God, that's horrifying. It's horrifying on a couple levels. One, it's horrifying to think that people will be going through these treatments or these journeys in that type of setting without the kind of medical backup that you're talking about. But it's also, if there is a market for that, that's also terrifying. Because that means that there are so many people in the Bay Area that have hit rock bottom, that are trying so desperately to get off that they will see this sign, and then just use this kind of off-label
it's a lot of pain.
back alley Ibogaine. And so, what is the path from here to FDA approval? Do you think it is? Do you think it is possible? Is there anybody who's kind of trying to push this through the process at Johns Hopkins or anywhere else?
Well, I think part of the challenge is that with any psychedelic right now, what we see are continued publications coming out about psychedelics and their therapeutic benefit. And because they have not been approved yet by the FDA and they haven't been rescheduled by the DEA, part of the challenge is people are going to continue seeking out these quote unquote treatments in settings where they are not offered from medical professionals. And unfortunately, people who come in contact with folks in this underground market might actually have no idea what they're actually taking. Someone could be saying that it's Ibogaine and it might be some other kind of research chemical because again, it's unregulated here. So I think I hear quite often from people who have found an underground practitioner to use 5-MeO-DMT or psilocybin and then ended up with debilitating anxiety and in the emergency department because they weren't properly screened or monitored or followed up with clinically. So unfortunately, these problems will continue to happen until we have, I think, FDA approval and we have legal access here to safe administration and medical oversight of psychedelic experiences for therapeutic purposes. The path forward to see whether or not any psychedelic will be approved will have to involve academic research, and we're involved in those clinical trials now. The first two candidates that will likely be approved in the next 2 years are psilocybin and MDMA. However, Ibogaine is much further behind in that process. And unfortunately, there's likely at least 7 to 10 years worth of research that needs to be done in legally sanctioned university settings here in the United States before the FDA would have nearly enough information to make it available to the public.
And meanwhile, 100,000 people a year plus are dying of opioid overdoses, while our kind of abstinence-only treatment industry utterly fails them and rakes in money and is getting rolled up by the private equity industry. Meanwhile, the president of the United States is okay with his son doing it in Mexico. Yeah, that seems fair, right?
I mean, and that's overdoses, let alone the suicide numbers, the spiking suicide numbers.
Right. Any final thoughts on this question?
Well, that's the biggest challenge that you've just called out, which is that right now there are a few select privileged individuals with the finances and the resources to be able to access these treatments in legal, safe contexts. But until we change our drug policy and our mental health treatment system here in the United States to one from criminalizing drug users and criminalizing and putting people away into systems that don't actually treat the conditions that they're diagnosed with, until we move from that into a public health model of drug policy, where we actually look at any kind of substance as something that has benefits and has risks, and people need to understand what those benefits and risks are in order to make informed decisions. And once we get to that point, like Portugal or other countries that have moved to that model, then we can actually probably start really addressing the deeper issues of why people have these addictions to begin with.
All right, really last thing. To me, the people or the interest groups that could actually make a difference here are the insurance companies. It could be Medicaid, but Medicaid is completely disorganized and can't make itself anything of a political force. But the insurance companies are getting absolutely taken to the cleaners by these scam artist treatment industries for these like $30,000 a month, 28-day miracles that don't work, and then they bring them back again, charge them another $30,000, charge the insurance company another $30,000. Seems like the insurance industry actually has a real incentive to push this along. Are they at all interested in this?
You know, it's a little bit of an unknown question. There are conversations underway right now to determine whether insurance will be open to psilocybin and MDMA therapy, in part because they're the closest to FDA approval right now. And there's actually been a federal task force that's been created to start collaborating through conversation between DEA and SAMHSA and other agencies that will oversee the dissemination of psychedelic therapy, in part to answer this question of whether insurance and Medicaid will cover it. I think that the writing's on the wall for how effective it is. You know, we've had several phase 2 and now phase 3 trials underway with psilocybin and MDMA showing consistently favorable results and more powerful, treatment effects than the current available treatment. So hopefully insurance will get behind that. Hopefully, we can within 4 to 5 years have this treatment available to more people. But with related to Ibogaine, it's going to be a lot longer until we can get those studies done. It all comes down to funding, though. Unfortunately, in this society, if the science isn't funded, then the science just takes forever to get done.
Yeah, if I were United Health, I would just fund it. Professor Alan Davis, thank you so much for joining us. Really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Good night.
All right, that does it for this Counterpoints Friday. I guess happy Election Tuesday to you.
Happy election
We'll be here on Tuesday. Tune in to Breaking Points Tuesday night.
That's right. We'll be here with the whole gang and are looking forward to breaking down those results as they come in a way that you can expect the legacy media absolutely not to. So we're excited to do the sort of signature, be a part of the signature Breaking Points election night coverage. Should be a good time. Maybe I'll bring beer.
There you go.
No, Sagar can't drink it.
All right, have a great weekend.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.